Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Darren Shan reread video. This is going to be my discussion on the saga of Larten Crepsley, book number 3, which is Palace of the Damned. So 3 out of 4 books, just one more to go next week. And this is definitely a very good one. It sort of has the same thing as book 2, where the title and what the kind of cover and title combination leads you to believe the book is about is only one relatively small section of the book. In this case, right at the start, compared to it being more towards the end of the second book. But I think that's just the thing with the title. The book has to be called something, and sure, it maybe doesn't represent, like, 4/5 of the book, but it's a notable part at the start because where Larten is at the end of book 2 going into this book, in this kind of awful position where he's looking after this young child, what he's just done, and the fact that he is now just, recovering basically from this illness that, in combination with a bunch of other things, caused him to go on this rampage and kill nearly everyone on the Pearly Tornado. But now he finds himself in Greenland, just in this icy expanse, and it seems like he and the young boy are destined to die. So that's kind of where we jump in here with just what's going on here. Plus, if you've been paying attention, you know what important sort of vampire historical location is here in Greenland, and that's exactly what we go for straight away. So we do have Larten being basically like suicidal right at the start here, just kind of wanting in a way just to find the right place to die, and he doesn't do anything like immediately because he sort of wants to try and save the boy, but then he's not really finding any towns or location in Greenland where he can like drop the boy off. So he's just sort of, again, losing the will to live in the middle of like a snowstorm, basically. He sees these kind of colors within the snowstorm, later revealed to be, I suppose, minor kind of like glimpses of Mr. Tiny, who is actually in the vicinity, subtly guiding Larten somewhere. And so he thinks he finds this cave, which is where he feels he and the boy will die. I suppose he'll leave the boy in there to kind of die basically a more kind of peaceful death, and then he will throw himself off an icy cliff to have a more vampire kind of heroic death type thing. But the cave turns out to just be a sort of small entrance to a much larger kind of location, and this is the Palace of the Damned from the title. This is the kind of, what do they call it? The Tomb of Perta Vin Graal, which was set up from like the first book, and it's been mentioned like all the way up to now, that here was this vampire who was said to be like one of the best fighters of all time. But then, after being this hero for like so many years of his life, he led a bunch of his followers to their kind of defeat, his like first defeat, because he didn't know what defeat tasted like. And this sort of caused him to, become a bit isolated, and he basically just stayed out in the kind of wilderness here, created this palace apparently, and they just heard word about this later on, the vampires, from some of the followers who kind of came back. Very interesting stuff here, because in a way it's Larten kind of following in sort of similar footsteps here, of finding himself in this place, considering himself one of the damned basically, and thinking like in a way like the person the place is named after, is this destined to be the kind of place where he should die as well? But it's notable because in so doing this, he becomes like the first vampire since that like initial kind of group of people to locate this place and confirm it is like 100% real and everything. So he kind of goes down in history a little bit here with what he accomplishes, but he still ultimately feels like he has to die here. So He leaves the baby inside, goes to jump off the cliff, and as he literally walks off the cliff, realizes that, oh, I'm not actually prepared for this, and he starts actually trying to grab hold of something. And this is where Mr. Tiny gets introduced. So he actually sticks out a hand to save Larten. And we get this kind of very interesting dynamic, because Mr. Tiny is always interesting when he just interacts with characters. And this is him more directly trying to put pieces into a position. And of course, it's interesting. He just kind of answers most of Larten's questions. He maybe doesn't seem as ominous as he does in a lot of other scenes here. But just names the child, gives the child a name. It's Gavner Pearl. That's a really, really cool connection that they finally reveal that at this point. So this is Gavner's origin, and that obviously means that knowing how close their friendship is in the main saga, knowing that this is where it starts means there's quite a bit of a journey to go on with Larten and Gavner to get to that point. And we explore quite a bit of that over the course of this book as we go through, of course. But Larten basically just starts asking Mr. Tiny a bunch of questions about sort of, why are you here focusing on me? Why would you purposefully try to save me? Because he does explain that, like, oh, occasionally I choose specific people to sort of give a little push in the right direction. And he's like, well, why me? Because we know he's focused on Larten as soon as he saw him. So this gets sort of brought up a little bit later on in one of the scenes later with Ivana. Effectively just pointing out that, you know, Larten is this character who has been targeted by destiny because he is destined to play an important part in what is ultimately Mr. Tiny's big plan, which is the War of the Scars and what all happens there. This big event that is going to entertain him so much. And for Mr. Tiny, he's kind of like, if I let you die here, all the fun ends. Whereas you're going to have quite a life up to meeting Darren and Steve, and then the craziness is going to happen from there. And that's why I'm directing you and putting you into this position here. And then, interestingly, he just leaves. And the book, as we end part 1 and go into part 2, we just straight away cut to Larten is in Paris now. He gets out of Greenland. And it's an interesting decision to basically not cover in any significant detail how Larten gets Gavner and himself out of Greenland. Now, this is where it'd be quite a few pages to ultimately just maybe establish that he goes to a town, rebuilds up his strength, and because it is a place where people live, there's of course a way off the country, out of the country. So, you know, if they got here, he can get out of the country. And it's just highlighting that this is not one of the particularly notable sections of Journey in this story, just that this is what changes Larten. And this is where we get the shift away from the Larten who was very a bit like all over the place in book 2, not knowing what exactly he wants to do. Whereas the first part of this book is very much meant to be, for the most part, Larten kind of, in a way, settling down in that kind of chaos of his life. We'll see as we go into sort of like part 2, basically, and kind of 3, that he still stays away from, you know, properly rejoining the clan once again. But as we go into part 4 and 5, this is what sort of solidifies him on the path of, you know, he is a vampire, this is what he wants to do. But as expected, based on the Arrow stuff with his wife from the previous book, they do go in that direction with Larten, of him actually finding actual love and trying to, in a way, do what Arrow has done. And he finds an era of peace for himself here. And this is ultimately what he needed, the last kind of thing he needed before he was able to fully commit to the vampire clan. So, very interesting stuff here. We're in 1906 in Paris, and they set it up quite nicely with the idea that, like, it's this opening scene where it's just Larten flying one of the early kind of prototype planes that can just barely get off the ground. And it's all referencing the whole Wright brothers versus Alberto Santos Dumont and all that sort of situation. It's a fun little reference to kind of real history that, oh, hey, he was involved in it and testing it. But they straight away establish that he has met this woman, Alicia. They have fallen in love. And there is also like a proposal eventually here over time. And again, like, we're getting through the content relatively quickly here, but you know, this is at the point where we do begin to settle on scenes a little bit longer. In book 2, it maybe felt like we were really scene to scene. We were going like 5 years here, 5 years there. Here, you can sort of see the sense of like, okay, we're much more focused in on a few characters. We're still passing through time quite a bit, but there's more of a clear direction, I think, for book 3 into book 4 and kind of the final kind of stage here before we start the saga itself. So I think all that stuff is working well, and it was just that you needed to be a little bit scattered all over the place in a way like Larten was during that era of his life, whereas this is more moments where he does sort of choose to properly kind of settle down for a while. So things are going well with Alicia, and of course you get the idea that he's going by Hurston with her. So she doesn't know him to be Larten. She calls him Ver, which is kind of interesting connection that, again, here is the era where the portrait gets taken, painted, that is ultimately the one Steve uses to identify Larten in the first book of the main series. This is the woman who he's kind of with, and this is where the whole name connection actually comes out. So this is all really nice, really works well here, and we get the idea that, you know, effectively Gavner is their, you know, son, effectively. But the dynamic is different in that Larten refuses to have a fatherly kind of role with Gavner. He looks out for him and cares about him and does ultimately, I think, love him to a certain degree, but he purposefully holds back because he was the one who killed his actual, like, parents. So it's actually more, you know, Alicia specifically who has adopted Gavner and actually cares for him as a mother, and Larten is just the sort of, you know, tough, almost hard to please kind of father figure. And you see a kind of young Gavner really wanting it to be more, wanting Larten to actually be his father figure. But this is where, of course, Larten can't bring himself to not like torture himself for what he's done in the past. And you sort of question it, you know, like in this case, is Larten doing the right thing in terms of, like, I think they directly discuss it, and it's discussed later on in the book, the idea of, like, you know, I'll tell him about what I did at a later point and see what happens then, which is the ending of this book. But for now, he purposely chooses to hold back, and you sort of wonder, could he just, like, temporarily forgive himself, lie, and just live that kind of happier life? But this is him still trying to make amends ultimately for the massacre on the ship from before, and that pretty much goes all the way up until, like, the kind of 4/5 of the way through this book, where we get him, you know, it's just a kind of minor moment in the middle of the kind of war going on that he chooses to help a group of people, just highlighting that he's always going to try and do little bits and pieces like this to make amends for this moment where he did do something incredibly bad. So things are going well. We get the sort of proposal eventually. She accepts. Again, she doesn't know he's a vampire or anything like that. He is hiding everything here. But it's working well. They both really care for each other. Then the kind of twist happens, of course, to keep the story going, and that is that Larten meets Tanis Yule again. So he turns up in France, and he's running like casinos now. And then notably in terms of visuals, he goes from being, I think they described him as being kind of like this kind of like thin character, to now being really, really large and big. But he runs all these casinos and so on, and he actually, it seems like, comes normally back into Larten's life. Now, cleverly, they hold back on revealing like a lot of the sort of circumstances surrounding this, and it actually just goes back to, hey, it seems like they've both grown a little bit, and Tannish is just sort of happy to see Larten again. Larten's kind of happy to interact with another vampire again, and they just, spark up their friendship once more. He becomes like a friend of the family, basically, and he actually becomes the kind of father figure, effectively, or at least some sort of a close uncle type figure to Gavner, kind of filling that role where Larten kind of refuses to. And then also he eventually offers Larten kind of the idea of like, we'll go into business together, working at the casinos. But again, things seem to be going very, very well until it's revealed that some of the women under the employment of Tannish begin to show up dead. And Larten begins to investigate this, and it's discovered that, oh, Randall Chain from the previous book, the guy who challenged Tannish, that basically caused him to leave and go into exile, this guy has been effectively hunting Tannish across the world for his like cowardice in terms of constantly refusing the duel from the start of that book. And basically that this has happened multiple times. Tannish is successful and keeps doing this in a variety of different places, but there's a trail of bodies here as Randall begins to try and target the people who work for Tannish to force him into the fight. But he, of course, refuses to do it because he hasn't like redeemed himself, Tannish here. He is still fundamentally a coward, and you see that he hasn't grown in a way as a vampire. And he's still that kind of dishonorable vampire ultimately. And it all builds up like Randall Chain isn't really involved in sort of much of kind of what happens here. But you do get this interesting kind of sequence towards the end where Larten and Randall fight, and it's real that like Mr. Crepsley, of course, is stronger in this case and nearly takes him out. Tannish sort of knocks Mr. Crepsley out, and the kind of reveal here is that Tannish, to kind of like get away from all of this, has framed Mr. Crepsley for what's happened here, because you get this moment like where you see Randall just realize like, wow, you are just like a piece of work. Even for a vampire, you are awful doing what you are doing. And it's almost like, okay, like this is what's happened, but I can't bring myself to kill like either of you. And so Randall, instead of killing Mr. Crepsley or Tannish in this situation, is just like, do you know what? I'm just gonna leave, because your betrayal here means he's going to go after you. So Mr. Crepsley is going to go after Tannish at some point. And for Randall, that's a more fun prospect in a way, watching that happen. That's how little he kind of sees in Tannish anymore. But the framing here that happens here is that Tannish kills one of his own workers and basically screams that, hey, Hurston is a vampire. And this causes Larten to have to leave at this point, because they do establish that Bram Stoker has written Dracula. So people are more aware of the idea of a vampire and so on. And so this is actually a threat. So he forces to leave. He does have a scene where he does actually reveal everything to Alicia, but it does ultimately result in the two of them, going their separate ways. She is so kind of distraught about what's happened. She's more upset about the lies rather than being like fearful of him being a vampire. based on when they interact again later in the book, it does seem like she doesn't fully take a lot of what Larten says to her about being a vampire into account. So it is more of the case of just, I never even knew your actual name or anything like that. And she's questioning so many different things. So once Larten kind of confirms that, Gavner is not a vampire, she just accepts that, look, he's my son. You chose me to look after him. We're going. And this is the kind of end of this section of Mr. Crepsley's life. And again, it's this idea, like this happy, probably the happiest he's ever been because of this true love, ruined by someone he thought was his friend. And just because Tannish is such a coward and does so much to sort of keep himself alive. And so there is an agreement right before they leave, though, that Alicia doesn't want to see him lose himself to revenge. So she basically is just like, in the near future, like the next couple of years, don't immediately spend your life searching for him. And she's kind of like, I guess eventually if you happen to come across him, I guess there's nothing I can do. But if this is real, and I do believe you that you have said this is all, that the relationship, the love was real, do this one final thing for me. And he does agree to it. So this is what allows for the next section of the book to not just be hunting down Tannish Yule, which I think is probably for the best, because we then have Larten going back to Vampire Mountain, reuniting with Seba and Wester here, which is kind of nice, seeing this again. So I think it's at this point, Seba gives him the red clothing, and this is where we really get to see Larten, I suppose, kind of truly follow in the footsteps of Seba here, kind of 100%. We see that Wester is now like one of the main guards who like guards the entrance to the kind of the room where all the princes are. Lots of reveals at this point. Like, this is where we see Mika comes back, and it turns out that Ara is now a vampire, and she is Mika's apprentice. So we start that kind of relationship a little bit here, where we knew, of course, there was a bit of an attraction between those two, and it sort of continues a little bit here with a bit of a rivalry in there, where it appears that Mika also kind of likes Ara too. But I actually think they do a good job with how they do that over the course of the book, where it seems like there's going to be this real feud between Larten and Mika, but it actually, right when it looks like they're about to fight, they just kind of have a discussion with each other and realize that, do you know what, she wouldn't think any better of either of us if we fought basically like over her. So let's just shake hands and kind of see who she decides to sort of like favor more ultimately going forward. So that kind of was a nice kind of moment. You do get, when the kind of council actually starts, it looks like Larten and Ara are about to face off on the bars, but another vampire gets like thrown onto the bars and like destroys them, so their match never actually happens. And interestingly, for one of the maybe only times so far in the series, you get the moment where it's full on like they just reference the saga and the idea that Ara dies in the saga, and that they never get to actually have their proper official match on the bars. And it's just kind of like discussed as time goes on that they had a good relationship. They always kind of teased and kind of put off the idea of like when they'd have their big fight on the bars, but it just never actually happened. So interesting stuff there. It's at this point you get the reveal that, oh yeah, the current only prince, and it's the new prince left in the mountain at the moment, is Vansha. So we see him as a brand new prince, which is a bit of a surprise, but it's pretty cool. And from there, this is where we get a time skip. One paragraph ends, and then a few years later, a committed Larten has now fully become a vampire general. And we just get again the idea that He spends a lot of time training in the mountain with a lot of the other characters that we of course know. But eventually he is given his first kind of big mission. I think Vansha kind of tells him to go on this mission, and that is to kind of come with him and find Arrow, because Arrow, they've become aware of the fact that Arrow's wife has been killed by Vampanese, and he has now set himself on this path where he is just hunting down, finding any Vampanese he can, challenging them to duels, and killing them. And they are worried that this really impressive vampire is going to just get himself killed on this path of vengeance. So we see a kind of Vansha. Is it? No, it's not Vansha doesn't go because he's acting as a prince. We have Larten goes. We have he takes Wester with him, which is interesting, because one of the memories I have of this series is that I feel like Wester was a bit more involved than he has been so far. But that's more for the next book ultimately. But this is kind of meant to, in a way, be the kind of reintroduction where like they actually both leave Vampire Mountain together, whereas Wester has just been in the mountain for like a large amount of time of the last 50 years or so. So that's all cool. And yeah, the details here of what happened is that they do find Arrow. This is where it's revealed like the war is going on, basically World War I. And in the middle of all of this, of course, is where Arrow is doing his kind of hunting and fighting. This is where, Vansha is with them. Why am I misremembering that? This is where he saves a group of soldiers in the middle of a battlefield and guides them to a trench to sort of save them, and just the little things he's doing as redemption for what happened on the ship all those years ago at this point. But they eventually find Arrow and they talk to him. In the middle of all this, he is challenged. He is approached and challenged by a Vampanese. He does kill the Vampanese. And what happens here is that you expect that Larten or Vansha will be the one to kind of get through to him. But actually Wester being there is actually the one to get him back on track, because Wester starts to talk to Arrow and connect to him on a stronger level than even Mr. Crepsley can, by mentioning that, like, oh, there was also a woman I loved who I was basically forced to have to leave. But because Arrow had such a tragic nature in that, like, his wife is dead versus Larten just being forced to leave, that doesn't quite connect. But Wester connecting on the level of, like, they both hate the Vampanese, and he tells him that there's others in the mountain who agree that we should, like, properly, like, team up and go against them, where if there's enough of us, the princes will be forced to kind of organize some sort of a thing to actually fight against the Vampanese. And they're all worried about this, but ultimately it gets Arrow back on track, and he does agree to go back to Vampire Mountain. So this is where we get another separation here, where Vansha brings Arrow back to the mountain, and then Larten and Wester actually go to meet Ivana, who is her tent is nearby once again. So this is a fun scene, because this is meant to obviously reference the idea that Larten is going to talk to Ivana, one, to apologize for how their last meeting kind of left off, and then two, he wants to know what to make of the fact that, like, Mr. Tiny is, like, directly kind of interfering in his life. So immediately there's an apology from both sides of just, he apologizes for what he did, she apologizes for kind of like overreacting, and she gives him the kind of almost magical collapsible pots that he has, as we see in the series, the main series. And then when it comes to the whole Mr. Tiny thing, like before, she just sort of notes that it's not an amazing thing that you're basically being targeted here by destiny, but that the little I will tell you about your future is that you are destined for paradise. And in a way, him focusing on you means you are an important person who will play a role and are destined to live, like, at least a decent life. So that kind of gives Larten some hope, but obviously you have to be cautious if Mr. Tiny, his attention is on you. So that's a nice kind of little meeting with Ivana, nothing more than kind of like you need to do as such. But there's a few things. She does show like an interest in like, oh, what's Ara up to, and she asks about her. But then going into sort of like the final section of the book, we do have Larten and Wester go back to France because Larten wants to find Alicia again to see what has happened after all these years have passed. And it's a nice moment. It resembles a little bit of like when he went back to his hometown and just sort of like he watches from a distance but doesn't engage. But in this case, he watches to just see what's happened and figures out that, okay, she married someone else, and so that she has an actual daughter. But also, Gavner isn't really around. So he realizes that, okay, I have to actually go up to her and talk to her and get the details on what has actually happened here. So, and it's really nice. And this is the good thing about this, is that they are actually able to have a decent conversation together. And they're actually happy to see each other. And there's little moments where you think like, oh, could they resume their relationship? But there's just seems to be this agreement that like, that's probably not for the best. But the friendship is what does kind of happen here. That comes out of this. And especially towards the end, there's just this nice interaction as we kind of get to the idea that she has clearly like aged, whereas Larten kind of hasn't. And that's an interesting dynamic to kind of deal with as well. But the reveals here are that her husband died in the war a year ago, and she's just not really telling anyone about it, and we'll deal with all of that when the war actually ends. Gavner is gone. Tannish returned and blooded Gavner, made him a vampire. And so Gavner has left with Tannish as basically his assistant, because the connection here is that Gavner used Tannish as his actual father figure. And so because of what happened, of course, Mr. Crepsley explains the whole situation before. It was already explained to her, but that, you know, Mr. Crepsley is an honorable vampire, and as even she says herself, is a good man at heart. She has to trust him to find Tannish eventually. And you sort of see after what happened here, she changes her mind and is kind of like, I told you before to basically not take revenge or wait to take revenge. But after what he did in terms of coming back and manipulating Gavner the way he has, I take that all back. You find him and you take him out. And it just is this sense of like she has, over the last few years, suffered quite a lot, and the loss of Gavner has really hurt her, and so this is that agreement here. So that's all good. And eventually, like there's a quick aside where like I think they go back, Larten goes back to the mountain. Yeah, because I think that's where Wester kind of like decides he's going to stay in the mountain again. But then Larten and Vansha go to find Tannish because they need to make the stop off of Vampire Mountain so they can use the Stone of Blood to actually locate where Tannish is. And pretty much after that, Tannish is in Russia, basically, a town in Russia. And yeah, Gavner is his assistant, and the whole father figure dynamic. And Gavner just full on it's different than a lot of the other like assistant kind of relationships we see. Like Gavner like really looks after Tannish to like there's a real sense of care here, and he defends his master like all the way about this. But Tannish, being the kind of coward that he is, kind of comes clean about this, has this big emotional moment about like why he did what he did, and is in a way kind of almost trying to manipulate the situation of just like, surely you wouldn't kill me in front of him, and like how important like your connection actually is. But eventually Tannish does actually go as far to reveal that like, oh yeah, I framed him for murder before, but like, and I've done all these terrible things. And so Gavner quickly realizes that, like, oh, Tanish, who I respect more than anyone, has lied to me all these years. Because he hadn't told him quite a few details about being a vampire. Really notable ones. Like, he'd almost gotten across the idea that there's only like a handful of vampire out there in the entire world. And he's stunned when Larten is like, no, there are thousands of us. We live honorable lives, nothing like your master. I don't know what he's been telling you, but it is wrong. And it all comes down to this really interesting point where, like, Larten, in a way, you're completely fine, like, if he kills him. But he makes the decision to sort of let him go. But because Vansha is also there, as Tanish flees, Vansha just sort of kills him. It basically happens, like, off screen. Leaving Gavner and Larten to have their conversation, and the kill is just completely, like, off in the distance. And it's this really interesting moment where, like, Gavner is kind of upset at Tanish's death, and Larten is just immediately like, I will not apologize for what happened here, because I think that there's a bit of a discussion about, like that was sort of a trick in a way, like letting him go, but knowing that there was someone else who was going to kill him. But they're like, he is a vampire. He killed an innocent, tricked, manipulated all these people. By the laws of the clan, this is what had to happen. I just chose not to do it myself, and there was someone else there for him. In a way, highlighting that it wasn't, in this case, just an act of kind of like personal vengeance, but this was like the clan dealing with their own issues. Kind of, in a way, showing the kind of honor of the clan, that they kind of do kind of self-police themselves. But at this point, Larten does decide to reveal that I killed your biological parents. He hands the knife to Gavner, and the book ends on this amazing cliffhanger of, like, pass judgment on me. You should kill me because I killed your parents, but it is your choice to make. In this case, that, like, I'm not here to kill him, but I'm giving you the choice to kill me if you want. And this is a really interesting one, because we know Gavner cares about Mr. Crepsley from before, but now he's had all these kind of reveals and, like, lies about what he's been told kind of happen. What decision does he make? We know what decision he makes, and it's even in my copy of the book, there is also, like, basically the first chapter of book 4. And this is a first edition copy, so, like, this was here in, like, the first printing. You get the reveal through that as well. So it's an interesting one where, like, it's a nice cliffhanger if you didn't have any context as to what happens next. But even in context, it is an interesting one, because you know what decision he eventually makes, but you kind of want to see what exact thought process it is for Gavner. And over the next couple of years, what is their relationship actually like? Because it's like Larten very clearly does not at all want to be considered Gavner's father, but they do have a close relationship. So it's not quite like, say, Seba and Larten, where it's very clearly the two will openly, like, consider each other as that relationship. He won't allow himself that here because of what he did to his parents. He doesn't like the idea of, you know, like, killing to be the replacement, and you kind of understand that to a certain degree. But it's this weird dynamic where it's just, it's more than just kind of master and a kind of apprentice, assistant. But it's not quite fully familial, so it's like, basically the idea of, like, a strong friendship here is kind of the intent of kind of where we're going. But that just kind of brings the book to a close. And again, there are some scenes where we skip around a bit towards the middle, but I think I like the kind of extra focus that we get here, because even little bits that I maybe skipped over a bit there, where I think one of the last times we're back in Vampire Mountain, Larten witnesses Wester having an in-depth discussion. I think they argue for like 3 hours with Kurda, who is, I think, his first appearance in the books here as like a relatively new vampire here, so we know how important Kurda is. Those two arguing about Vampanese, and we find out that in the time that has passed, Arrow has kind of taken a middle point in between them, where he's not full on then the same path as Wester, where Wester seems to want to start a war between Vampanese and vampires. Kurda, of course, is more sympathetic towards the Vampanese, and Arrow takes a position somewhere in the middle where, because of personally what happened to him, he doesn't like the Vampanese, but he maybe thinks actively wanting a war to happen is not a good situation really at all. So that's an interesting one for him, knowing where that character actually goes. So I just think it's a good example, good use of characters like the return of Tanish. He was fascinating over the course of the book because in moments where you do kind of trust him, he is kind of likable in so many ways, and that like he's calling like Mr. Crepsley Quicksilver a lot and so on. But then he is such a coward. He's so out to just save himself that he'll do anything to make it happen, and it's a very different type of vampire than almost any other that we've really seen before. So it's almost like a fitting end that he is just like off screen killed right at the end. But like it is the kind of brutality of what he did, of like betraying Larten in the way he did, and then going back to take Gavner with him to be his like loyal assistant, knowing the kind of relationship that they had. And anyway, not caring what that would do to Alicia, who was a family friend of kind of both of them. Sure, you wouldn't say of the characters involved, Alicia and Tanish is not the closest, but there was some trust there, and it was just kind of completely like shattered in all of this. But definitely the Gavner stuff is a very important part of this book. Like, there's your introduction on this other very, very notable character, and establishing why, like, okay, despite this kind of crazy origin, this is why it was always just a kind of friendship between the two of them that we saw in the saga. So that's a good explanation there. And weird things like, wow, who knew that Mr. Tiny named Gavner? That's a big one for sure. So that's everything I want to say about book 3. And then, like I said, next week we finish things off with book 4, Brothers to the Death. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. That's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.